today, especially given that it's after hours and many of you are probably um, looking forward to heading home. And we truly appreciate your commitment to this session, and we recognize the extra effort it takes to attend at this hour. Unfortunately, due to time difference between Canada and South Africa, this was the earliest time that we could get to schedule this webinar. And we are excited to have our facilitator joining us all the way from Canada to guide us through this insightful session. The focus of the session is on telling your library story through data. As we all know that we generate a lot of data as libraries, so this session will help us in making sure that we make use of that data effectively. But without wasting any more time, I'm just going to hand over to Dr. Len to introduce our facilitator for today. Over to you, Dr. Len.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues in South Africa, and good morning to our colleagues here in Canada. I hope you are all well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Miss Colleen Bell has been an academic librarian for more than 30 years, both in the United States and Canada. She started her career as a systems librarian, then moved into teaching and learning, information literacy, and instructional technology. Over the past 18 years or so, has been engaged in library assessment, otherwise known as wrangling library data, off the side of a desk. So 3 years ago, she finally achieves the title of assessment librarian and now gets to officially play with library data on a regular basis. Now, I would like to share something else. On the creative side, Colleen is actively involved in supporting users in the University of Fraser Valley's libraries makerspace. And I was quite excited to engage with her during this week, during the Makerspace event. So on that note, I now hand over to Colleen Bell to share with us how to tell your story through data. Colleen, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. Good day. I'm speaking to you from Stolo Tumuk, which is the sacred territory of the Hakamelan-speaking Stolo peoples, who have nurtured and stewarded the land on which I work since before the first sunrise. Many years ago, I visited your beautiful Table Mountain, so I thought I would share. I thought I would share a photo of one of our many beautiful mountains. This is Mount Shiam, situated about half an hour east of here. And it's an important part of the Stolo mythology and culture. So the Stolo are the indigenous peoples who inhabited this land long before the settlers came along. I also want to acknowledge and thank the Liasa Academic and Research Library sector for this opportunity, and particularly Lynn Kleinfeld, who is my colleague here at UFV, and who extended this invitation to present. I think she was in a meeting when I happened to email her, and she asked me then if I would be interested in presenting. So I said yes. So my aim is to leave time at the end for questions, but I'm incredibly bad at estimating timings when I'm presenting from slides. So please submit your questions as we go along in the Q&A. And I will be sharing these slides and notes with the organizers following the webinar, but I'll also try and answer as many questions as I can. Okay, so the key takeaways for this session, I'm going to talk about the importance of data-driven storytelling in libraries, share some practical examples of how libraries have successfully used data to tell their stories, talk about the implications of data collection and use, and then share some tools and resources to aid in your data storytelling journey. Okay, so Most libraries do not exist as islands. We are part of larger organizations with missions, goals, values. And because of this, we are largely reliant on those organizations for the resources needed to carry out our mission as libraries, to achieve our goals, and to serve our communities. But libraries are somewhat opaque to our parent organizations. They have a vague understanding of what we do. We have information, our users need information, and we have, in many cases, these lovely study spaces that our students like to use. But we all know that libraries are much more complex than that. We are often open when the rest of the institution is not. We support the curriculum through our collections, through teaching, and through services such as reference. We are a hub for services such as computers, printing, photocopying, scanning, study spaces. We are the place where students can access resources they might not have access to otherwise. Unfortunately, we have lots of data that demonstrates how well used we are as a service to our community. Most of our systems generate data with every transaction, every click, every press of the enter button. We receive feedback from our users. We may even actively seek out data or collect it ourselves. But data alone doesn't tell us anything. And it doesn't give our parent organizations a reason to support us at the level we need to be in order to be effective. This is where storytelling comes in. Stories are memorable. They connect with our emotions. They are much easier to remember than facts and statistics. So we use library stories to demonstrate our value and impact. This goes beyond mere numbers of how many people are using our services and programs and how often. We want to describe the value that we bring to our users and demonstrate the impact that our services have on them. Stories can help us do that. They help gain the attention of the larger organization, particularly those who make the decisions about where the organization's resources will be directed. Stories can help persuade decision makers by tapping into their emotions, and they can help engage the decision makers in the goals of the library. And why do we need to do this? Because there's a lot of competition for increasingly scarce resources. I don't imagine that libraries in South Africa are much different from libraries in Canada in this respect. If we want to add staff, increase our collections budgets to keep up with inflation, or introduce new services or programs, we need to get the decision makers on our side. We need to help them understand the value of what we want to do. So reading backwards from this diagram here, we start with a goal. Perhaps it is to increase resources or to introduce some kind of change. We need to grab the attention of the decision makers, engage them in our vision, and persuade them to support the goal. Then we craft the story of the value or impact of that action. So this is what author Brent Dykes calls the path to value. Notice that our data story is in the middle. It is not the end of the process, but it is an important and I would say crucial means to an end. Before we can develop our story, we of course need data, and we have lots of that. But we also need to make sense of the data and determine what it is actually telling us. And that's where we are gaining insights from the data. Once we have a data story, we can use it to persuade the decision makers, take action, and determine the value or impact of that action. I mentioned earlier that stories tap into our emotions, and there are studies to support the connection between emotions and decision making. For example, researchers from Rice University have uncovered a strong connection between emotions and decision making. For example, they found that schadenfreude, which is the feeling of malicious joy at the misfortune of others, is much more effective than feelings of sadness or happiness at leading us to make practical choices. And I'm not sure that's telling us to focus on schadenfreude in our data stories, but you know, it does demonstrate a connection between emotions and decision making. So I've talked about why storytelling is important. Now let's talk about what makes a good data story. I mentioned earlier that libraries are rich in data, but also that data alone is neither memorable nor meaningful. We need to tease out the story that the numbers are trying to tell. Humans are natural storytellers. We use stories, sometimes we call them anecdotes, to teach, to communicate, to warn, to enlighten, to relate, to document. I think about my Indigenous neighbors who have a strong oral history that is often communicated through stories. They can trace their history back thousands of years without the benefit of written record that Western cultures rely on so heavily, through stories. There are people within their communities who are designated as the knowledge keepers and whose role it is to communicate those stories to the next generations. It is a sacred and important role that requires a specific skill set. The same is true for data stories. The work is often delegated to specific employees within the library and requires a specific skill set. Least of all, the desire to actually work with data. I know lots of people who don't want to work with data, who say that looking at an Excel spreadsheet gives them hives. So yeah. Every good data story has three components. It has data, it has visuals or visualizations, and it has a narrative. So these three elements come together and work together to create a compelling data story. Narrative explains the data. It tells your audience what's happening in the data and why a particular insight is important. Your narrative should provide both the context for the data. Should provide the context for the data. I missed something here. Content and commentary are necessary elements in your narrative in order to fully appreciate the insight. Visuals or visualization enlighten your audience by allowing them to see patterns and outliers that would otherwise remain buried in rows and columns of data. They help your audience see insights they would otherwise not be able to. And then merging the narrative and visualization together engages and perhaps even entertains your audience. When you combine the three together, especially if you have the right data, you create a story that can influence the decision makers and drive change. Insights packaged as a data story builds a bridge to the emotional side of the brain, and emotions can influence decisions. Using brain scans, neuroscientists have shown that detailed information will activate two areas of the brain in an audience that are associated with the language processing. But they found that when someone is absorbed in a story, it stimulated many more areas of the brain. Stories are memorable. A study out of Stanford University found that 63% of participants could remember stories, but only 5% could remember a statistic. While only 10% of participants in this study incorporated a story, it was those stories that gained attention. Stories are persuasive. A study out of the University of Pennsylvania found that a story about a 7-year-old child in Mali was far more powerful at persuading donors than an infographic on the plight of African children. And finally, stories are engaging. John Allen Poulos, who's a mathematician, asserts that we approach stories and statistics with different mindsets. In listening to stories, we tend to suspend disbelief in order to be entertained. Whereas in evaluating statistics, we generally have an opposite inclination to suspend belief in order not to be beguiled. Psychologist Breanne Brock found that we tend to drop our intellectual guard and be less critical and skeptical when we're listening to stories. We want to see where the story leads us. Okay, so a few simple guidelines when you're thinking about data stories. You want to find the simple core repeatable message, and you want to keep repeating it. So you want to be really honest about goals and constraints. You want to iterate those together and often. So goals, constraints, goals, constraints, goals, constraints, always together. You want to only collect data that can be used, appended, and amended. And you want to remember that you work for the institution, not the library. So when you are telling your data stories, particularly when you're telling them to the decision makers within your institution, you want to keep their goals in mind. But it doesn't mean that you have to only tell stories that relate to their goals. You just have to help them understand how they help the institution further their own goals. All right, so I have a few examples to share with you. These are examples from 3 different Canadian libraries. This first one is my favorite. It tells a really simple story of how our collection budgets have absolutely flipped from spending most of our budget on firm or a fixed cost, one-time costs, to spending most of our budget on ongoing costs, which create an obligation that carries on beyond our fiscal year. What is really great about this particular story is that the author has gone so far as to say, you know, I know the obvious solution that's going to occur to you is just to cut subscriptions, but that doesn't really work because it's sort of like a never-ending cycle. We need to find new solutions to making our budgets more sustainable, and so offers those solutions. So this is a story that has the full package in it. And the simple core repeatable message here is that the library budget model is unsustainable, the current model. But we need investment in order to move to a new, more sustainable model. So it's trying to persuade our decision makers to invest some resources short term for long-term gains. This visual story came from a budget presentation for the Toronto Public Library, which is the largest public library in Canada. And what's really great about it is that it's just emphasizing, there's actually 2 things going on in here. It's saying we are relevant to our community because our numbers keep going up. But also in the current economic climate, we expect to need more resources because in the past, when we've been in recessions in the past in Canada is, while many say we're not in recession, we're at least entering a recession. We've seen an even more demand for our services during recession. So we expect that to happen over the next year. So the message is library use is up and we expect to see increasing demand for our services and resources. Finally, this is one that from my library that I am still working on crafting. I'm not quite sure I'm there yet at the compelling part, but what I wanted to show is that our library is being used. And I wanted to show that, you know, that we have multiple engagements with the library services and spaces and collections for every person who uses our library. And so this is kind of like so whereas the other 2 examples were sort of data over time, this is just a single point in time. This is taking a look at 1 semester, for example, or I can take a look at a single month and demonstrate that our library is valued by our community, that is being used. All right. We're way ahead of time here. So lots of time for questions. When we're thinking about collecting and using our data, there are some things that we want to be thinking about. I mentioned earlier that we want to collect data that is amendable, that we can add to over time. But there are some other aspects of collecting data that we want to pay attention to. One is this notion of personally identifying information, or PII. This is the data such as name or ID numbers, email addresses, physical addresses, phone numbers that can be tied back to an individual. And as libraries, we have legitimate need for this information, but we should only use PII when we're crafting data stories or analyzing the data for our data stories when it's absolutely necessary. And we should always make sure we understand completely the privacy laws and that we operate under concerning student-to-employee data. In British Columbia, for example, student data, the uses we can make of student data are extremely limited. So basically, if you are a professor, you can use student data for grades, but you can't, for example, if that student's parent contacted you and said, hey, I want to know if my daughter or son has been attending class, you can't even acknowledge that that student is in your class. So the privacy laws around student data are extremely strong. So you don't include PII when you're pulling information from library systems. Instead, or recommend you don't. Instead, use more general characteristics. So think about, okay, so maybe I'm just pulling data about students, or maybe I am pulling data that comes with, or what program the student is enrolled in, so that you can draw conclusions about the data that you have, and still describe the data and who your users are, but not in such a way that they can tie back to them directly. If you're matching data from your library systems with other data sets, so say, for example, you want to match data from your library system, so students who are using the library with, say, information, other information about them as students, so their grades or some other characteristic. You want to match that data, and then you want to remove that matching point from your data. So either remove it or anonymize it in some way. So if you're using student ID numbers, for example, you would come up with a way to change those student ID numbers so that on both sides of the data join, they're the same, but you can no longer tie it back to that individual student. And then finally, if you are storing data sets that have PII in them, you want to make sure that you limit who has access to those data sets, because of course, you still want to protect that data. You want to be wary of overselling your data, right? So you want to beware of constructing a narrative that asserts insights that are not supported by the data. So you want to make sure that you're telling the story that the data tells, not using the data to tell the story you want to tell. You want to state the context whenever possible. So for example, if I did a survey and it was not a representative sample of students, but rather sort of self-selected. So I sent the invitation out to every student and 1,200 students responded. I would always want to say in a survey that we conducted last spring, participants stated that or noted that, or 80% of participants were. So I want to make sure that I keep the context of the data clear, so that I'm not implying that it applies across the general student population, because the design of my survey, the methodology I used, it doesn't support that. I want to be thinking about the ethical implications of asking questions. So now, general questions like, have you used the library in the last 12 months? not a problem, right? But how do you identify as a person, right? By ethnicity or by gender or by, you know, these kinds of questions are sensitive questions, and you want to make sure they're tempting to ask because we want to fully understand the demographics of our student population, but we want to make sure that we have a need for that information. So for example, last spring, my library conducted a survey of students, and we decided to ask about identity, about their ethnicity and their ability or disability, because we wanted to know if students felt welcome and safe in our library, which is a very important to us. And we also wanted to know if they experienced barriers to accessing our libraries. Because we have large numbers of international students from one particular region within the world, we felt it was necessary to ask about identity so that we could find out if that particular group of students who use our library a lot felt comfortable and safe, and if they experienced any barriers, but also if other students who belong to other protected groups felt the same. I'm happy to report that between 97 and 98% of students across all of those categories feel safe in our library, so, and welcome. So that was a very, we were very happy with that result. So that's of those students who responded to the survey. That's not across the student population. When we're talking about data storage and retention, I mentioned earlier that you want to be collecting data that you can add to over time. But we need to keep questions in mind. For example, how long should we keep data once we've done what we need with it? Do we anticipate that we're going to need it again? Is it data that can be retrieved again from our library systems if needed? Or was it collected through a specific instrument for a specific purpose? So for example, we did a survey last spring. And now we have to think about how long we want to retain that data. Where do we store our data? Is it secure? Is this data that we can share openly? And if it contains personally identifying information, you cannot share it openly or should not share it openly. But if you can remove that personally identifying information, then you could potentially share it as an open data set for others to use. And how do we ensure that if our data does contain personally identifying information, that it's protected from access by those who should not be able to access it? And then related to this question is our questions about how we organize and access our data. So questions like who can access the data? And how do those who need access to the data find it? How is the data organized? I have been working on creating a data warehouse for my library that documents how data is collected, where it is stored, who can gain access to it, and in what format it's available. So is it just the raw data? Is there a spreadsheet with analyzed data, or is it part of a dashboard? Is it a report that was written in analyzing the data? So so those are the main things that we need to think about when we're collecting and using data. You know, the data that's collected in our systems, we sometimes have some control over what is collected. For example, I can't run reports that have of historical transactions, say historical circulations that are tied to a specific individual, because we have selected not to store that data in our historical data sets. But I can run a report of who currently has something checked out, because I may need to use that data in some way. So finally, I wanted to share some tools and resources with you that you might find helpful or useful. And in addition to the sources I've cited throughout my presentation, I tried to focus on resources that are free or perhaps useful additions to your library. In the case of books, you might just want to have it in your library collection. Okay, so the first thing is toolkits and frameworks for data storytelling. Now there is a new toolkit out there called Data Storytelling Toolkit for Libraries. So very directly relevant. It came out of a grant in the United States. It is available for anyone who wants to use it. There are there's information on the website on how to get access to the toolkit. I think parts of it might still be in development, but it is there. There are two toolkits that came out of the Association for College and Research Libraries in the US. The first is the Value of Academic Libraries Toolkit. This has been around for a while, but it's also, I think it has a lot of enduring value, and it has a workbook associated with it that helps you, that has a whole bunch of exercises that you can do with your colleagues, with stakeholders, with the decision makers, if you have a library board or an advisory committee, to try and determine what measures of value you want to use or could use for your library. And then more recently, they've created this project outcome, which actually is modeled on a public library project. So the Public Library Association in the United States created this project called Project Outcome, and then ACRL adapted it for academic libraries. And basically it's a set of tools, surveys, so it has survey templates. It's available to anyone who wants to use it. You just have to sign up. So there's surveys you can use and adapt. There are tools for analyzing the data from those surveys. So it's kind of like if you don't have access to those tools otherwise, or you don't have someone in-house who actually has experience creating surveys, then this can be a good tool to start with, because they've got some tested surveys and that you can start from. And then LibValue is a project, it started as a research project from, I remember which university in the States, but it has some tools for other types of measures you can use in your library to try and determine value. So for example, there's a heavy focus on working with faculty and what their needs are. And so these are several tools, and they're all free and available to use. Software. So, you know, we saw some earlier, I showed you some examples of some visualizations, some different ways of presenting data. And there are two very robust software packages available out there. They're web-based, so they're completely accessible. They have free and paid versions. One is Tableau Public. This is the one that I use or have used in the past. It allows you to build sophisticated visualizations and data stories. So it has a way to build, you can do the visualization, you can turn them into a dashboard, so you can bring multiple visualizations together in a dashboard and add some controls to allow the user to manipulate the data. And then it has the data story component where you can take a visualization, add the story, and that first story that I showed you about the hostile takeover, that's a Tableau data story that was created in Tableau. At least I'm pretty confident it was created in Tableau. The next one down, Looker Studio, is Google's version of Tableau. It's newer than Tableau. Tableau's been around for quite some time. It is kind of an industry standard, so a lot of people use Tableau. There's actually a really great community around Tableau that I was able to use several years ago when I was on a sabbatical and I was working with data and learning Tableau. And I use the community a lot, and they are very generous, very generous. And then Looker Studio is Google's version. It's newer. I have not played around with it much. It's very similar to Tableau in functionality. It's from Google. So if you are using, say, Google Apps, like their spreadsheet and word processing and whatever, it will actually integrate directly with those files. And then Excel. Excel is it's not free, but it is it does have very powerful tools available for visualizing data, and you can even use it to create interactive dashboards. It's a little more complicated, but and I'll try and remember to add to the notes before I send them off. There's a particular person on YouTube who does amazing videos around using Excel for a wide range of things. And focuses on business applications, but they're completely translatable to the library environment. Okay, so data rarely comes out of the systems or in a clean format, like exactly the format you need. Sometimes you need to make calculations. Sometimes you need to clean up the data itself. So you might have two different forms of the same category, and you need to go through and clean that up. So there's lots of data cleaning that needs to happen when you're working with data regularly. And so Excel, again, has a powerful set of formulas and data transformation tools that I use all the time. And that's where these videos come in handy, because I never remember formulas. I just go and I Google Excel formula to do this. Yeah, every time. And then Google Sheets, it's not as powerful as Excel, but it's free, and you can use formulas to clean and transform your data. And then there's a tool called OpenRefine. It's free, and I've found it's actually really powerful for transforming messy data, for cleaning up really messy data. And I taught a course a few years ago on working with data in libraries, and we used OpenRefine as the tool for cleaning messy data, and it works really, really well. There are lots and lots of people out there who are, data visualization people who have blogs and podcasts and newsletters. These are four of my favorites. Information is beautiful. It is worth it just to go and browse and peruse and just see what's there. Right now, there's a big emphasis on plastics. So a lot of the visualizations you see on the front page are about plastics. David McCandless, he's British, and he's a master at data visualizations, and these are just like so beautiful. So the title of the blog, Information is Beautiful, is absolutely true. He makes information beautiful and completely understandable. Storytelling with Data is a site that has a blog, but it also shows you data visualization makeovers. So it takes a visualization that's not quite working, and it makes it over and turns it into something that works really well. And then the other nice feature about it is they have this guide that tells you what kind of chart to use if you have certain kinds of data, and what chart is useful for. And I will say that Tableau and I believe Looker will both suggest chart types based on the data that you have. So, so the software itself can help you as well. Jump Charts is just a fun site because all it does is data makeovers. It just starts with one that's not quite working, and then it says, okay, so how can we make this work? And then the pudding is just cool because it has these visual essays. And so they use data and data visualizations to create a story around something, an idea or controversy, or and their focus is on information and entertainment. So yeah, so they're really and then there are books. I have a bookshelf, a very small bookshelf now. It used to be much more extensive, but I kind of culled it down to just the essentials. And most of it is the books I'm going to show you. So books by Edward Tufte. He is probably the most well-known, well-respected person out there when it comes to displaying data visually. These are two of his books that are particularly relevant, I think, to data storytelling. One is called Beautiful Evidence, and the other is called Visual Explanations. And he even uses the word narrative in the title. And his books have lots of explanation, but they have hundreds of visuals, which is what makes them really compelling, I think. Stephen Pugh is another, he's a data visualization expert. He has a book called Now You See It, An Introduction to Visual Data Sense Making. So his focus is on how do you make sense of the data, how do you gain insights, and you know, sort of what story is your data trying to tell. And then a book directly related to data storytelling in libraries, focusing on the visualization piece of it, but it is a guide to visual storytelling for libraries. I mentioned Brent Dykes earlier. His book on effective data storytelling actually focuses on how to drive change, right? So that's the focus of his book. This one I don't have on my bookshelf, but I'm tempted to buy it. We have it in our library though. So, and then Nathan Yao is another a person out there who he actually has a website called Flowing Data. And so this book, as well as another book that he wrote, came out of his website, and he focuses on data visualization, and he's focused on design and visualization and working with data to use the design and visualization of data. So yeah, so these are all really great resources to tap into. And so that brings me to the end of my presentation. And in case you haven't been able to see me on the screen, that's what I look like. And I do invite your questions. If you come up with questions afterwards, feel free to email me. Yeah, so I am going to stop sharing. And we can take a look at, I saw that there were some questions that came in, so. All right.
Wow, thanks, Colleen,
yeah.
for informative, insightful presentation. I certainly learned a lot. I like making notes. So, and of course, I'm coming to visit you for those books on your shelf there.
Okay, so if I'm looking at the questions, there's one here, in an era where data privacy and ethics are at the forefront, how can libraries ensure that they are telling their story responsibly without compromising user trust or privacy? And I think that, you know, if we are responsible about how we use, you know, that personally identifying information, if we ask questions that ask for sensitive information about our users, that we think carefully about why we want that information and how we're going to use it. If we say to our users that when we're doing the survey, we say your responses will be anonymous, then we need to make sure they will be anonymous. I will tell you something that happened when we did our survey, coming out of our survey last spring. So we asked students about barriers to accessing our library spaces, as well as our resources and services, but we asked them as separate questions. And one student, one of the comments that came through from a student was, this is not specifically about the library, but a young female student who talked about how she gets a young men approaching her and trying to get her to go out with them. And she tells them no, she's working, and she's and they're very persistent and they won't leave her alone. And that comment really struck me because we did tell students this would be anonymous. And yet here we have an issue coming up that's a potential safety issue or security issue. And a student who may not be aware of resources that are available to her, such as contacting the library staff or contacting security or, finding a safe space, right, on campus. And so we had to wrestle with that because we were able to connect the surveys with the survey data with the email address of the student. But we had told students it would be anonymous, and there's only one person who had access to those email addresses in connection with the data. And so in the end, we had to, because it wasn't an imminent security or safety risk, we had to simply settle with making sure that information got out to students about their right to feeling safe on campus and how they can address it. Sorry, you can see my really messy office behind me. I just realized. Yeah.
Thanks, Colleen. And I see the second question in the chat was actually answered during your presentation about the software and the tools. Thanks so much for sharing those tools and resources. It's good to just learn about the options that are out there. So I actually have a question regarding the ethics part. For interest sake, were you required to submit an ethics application at UWV for collecting the survey data?
Yeah, so the purpose of the survey was we are undergoing a review, much like programs do. And so we have an external review team and we were writing our self-study for this external review team to let them know, who we are as a library, how we function, what our students think of us, what our employee users think of us. And so we did this survey as a part of that. We did consult our ethics board here at UFE because we thought we might want to be able to use this data in other ways, like beyond just the. Because it was for review, you don't have to get ethics permission, or you don't have to do an ethics review if it's just for a program review.
Yes.
But you want to use the data otherwise. So their response was that they have a process where you can deal with that question at the point where you might want to use the data for something else. So they basically just advise us, because the process of going through the ethics compliance process. It's very extensive. You have to do this
Absolutely.
seminar online, you have to fill in this complicated, and we found that we couldn't answer a lot of the questions that were on the form because we didn't have a specific use in mind. It was just, so we will, if we want to use the data further, we will go through that ethics review in order to do that.
Okay. Thank you. It's a similar process that my colleague, I think he's still here in the session, Mr. Ramabina. We were also working on a project a few years ago where we were using usage statistics and being based at two different institutions. We actually had to go through that ethics process, Mr. Ramabina, you will recall, it was quite a lengthy process obtaining ethics from both institutions before we could use usage statistics of one database that we subscribed to at the time. So it's just something that is still fresh in my mind, and still being new at UAV, it was just good to know whether you needed to, at this point when collecting the survey data, you actually needed to go through that process. So yes, great.
I do see one other question here.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. And that is, how can libraries balance the use of quantitative data like circulation stats or usage metrics with qualitative data like user experiences or impact stories to create a compelling narrative that resonates with diverse stakeholders? And, you know, we ideally combine that kind of data all the time because the quantitative data is going to tell us how much, when, what, right? But it's those user stories that are going to tell us the why. And the why is what we really, you know, the why is what really gets at that value and impact, right?
Sure.
So ideally, you know, what you can do is you can, you know, take that quantitative data you have, which basically describes population, and then you can maybe you ask a question on, maybe you're doing a survey and you ask a question at the end of the survey, would you be willing to talk to us, right? In the interview. And so you can collect stories that way by soliciting volunteers to be interviewed. We asked on our survey, in addition to a lot of quantitative data, we got complaints that the survey was too long, and it really was. But this is the first time doing a survey like this, so we just really wanted to get all the information. But we asked open-ended questions such as, what barriers exist? What's missing? Like, what are we not doing that you think we should be doing? And through that, we were able to actually gain the kind of user experience impact story data. So you can ask questions in a survey like that. You can invite, for example, you can invite people to give feedback. So sometimes we talk about guerrilla assessment, where we just set up a station, and like maybe as students walk in the library, you've got an iPad, and you just ask them to, that's secured, of course, but you ask them to quickly tell you the answer to something. Or you can say, how was your experience at the library today? Or what are you here to do in the library today? Or, and you can sort of gain really quick data like that just by setting out some kind of way, sometimes a whiteboard or flip charts, and ask students to note their thoughts. It's anonymous, but it does get at those impact stories. And then interviews and focus groups are another way where you deliberately set up a session.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. I see, Dina, yes, I agree with your comment that it also depends on what data will be used for. Yeah. So definitely for if one is intending to publish, then yes, one would need to go through that ethical application process before one is then able to use that. And then another comment by Dina, I'm just going to read it out. I've also learned that social media engagements, comments can also assist us in getting that qualitative user experience, same as comments and complaints received through various channels. Absolutely. I just, I forgot to share this one. There's something special about the UAV library that I really enjoy, and that's the therapy dogs that come once a week. So during lunchtime, and it alternates. 1 week it's Mondays, 1 week it's Tuesdays. There are therapy dogs in the library for users to just pamper and, you know, sort of feel like comforting and just spending time with the dogs. I did that a few times. I'm a dog lover. I'm just curious. Have you received any feedback from users regarding the therapy dogs that come to the library and that whole experience?
Yeah, we asked about that on our survey, actually. We asked if we asked both students and employees if they had participated in particular events, and therapy dogs was one of them. We got comments on our survey about the therapy dogs, you know, keep them coming, we love them. Yeah.
Okay.
And we've had students coming into the library to the reference desk, for example, saying, when are the therapy dogs going to be here? So yeah, so they're popular for those among those who know about them and who come and visit them. Yeah, they're very
Thanks.
yeah.
Thanks so much. I'm not sure if there are any questions, other questions, colleagues. I know we're almost out of time. There's 3 minutes left. Teresa, yes. Oh, great. It's good to know that it's one of your interests to investigate the role or impact of the library in therapeutic elements to enhance or support student well-being. Lovely. Yes, I certainly do enjoy that. I find it therapeutic myself to spend time with the dogs. If there's no further questions, I'm going to hand over to Teresa
Thank you.
to do the vote of thanks at this stage. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lynn. It's so good to see you again. And thank you so much for bringing Ms. Colleen Bells to South Africa. We really appreciate the session has been very informative, and we love all those tools that she has shared. And also to our participants, thank you so much. It's very late in the afternoon, but you have decided to stay with us until now. You could have been elsewhere, but decided to be here. We really, really appreciate that. And what can we say to Liasa, Apelele? Thank you so much to you guys for always being a supportive tool to us to make, you know, all this happen, you know, the technicalities, to make sure that we are all joined together across the countries, you know. Dr. Lynn and Miss Colleen are very far in Canada, but here we are, you know, together. Thank you so, so much. We greatly appreciate. Thank you so much, Colleen. Thank you, Lynn. And thank you to our chair, Dina, as well, for all the logistics that went into organizing this powerful session. We look forward to many more to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And I want to add to the thanks, just a special thank you to Colleen for also making your efforts this morning to be at the library very early before it opened to present to us. and share such valuable information. Much appreciated.
Thank you. It was
Thank
a
you,
pleasure.
thank you, everybody. Good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. Bye.